Hello, and welcome back to the Surfer's Library. I'm Billy Jack, your guide through the pages of surf history, culture, and legend. This episode, we're excited to read selected excerpts from Phil Jarratt's incredible book, Mr. Sunset, the Jeff Hakman Story. Jeff Hakman was born in California in 1948, and by the age of 8, his father had already set him on a surfboard. 4 years later, the family moved to Oahu, and a year after that, still just 13, Hakman paddled out at Waimea Bay for the first time. Today's story picks up in 1965. At only 17 years old, Jeff finds himself invited into history, competing at Sunset Beach in the inaugural Duke Kahanamoku Invitational. Let's paddle out and learn how Mr. Sunset arrived on the world surfing stage. Chapter 8. By 1964, Dick Brewer and his Surfboard's Hawaii decal had become famous throughout the surfing world. His name was synonymous with quality construction and high performance in big waves. In other words, the purchase of a Brewer was a ticket to the big time. Of course, not every surfer had the technique to extract the best performance from Brewer's shapes, which even then were a great deal more subtle than the majority of the logs being punched out to satisfy the huge and growing market as surfing reached its commercial zenith. But that didn't matter. If you had a Brewer, you were on your way. The only problem was that it was almost impossible to get one if you were not a top-name surfer. Then, during the winter season of 1963-1964, it became impossible to get a custom-made Brewer or any other surfboard in Hawaii, owing to a Matson shipping line strike which halted the importation of blanks from the mainland. In California, a surfer and businessman named John Price had negotiated a deal with Brewer to manufacture boards under the Surfboards Hawaii label in Encinitas near San Diego. So, as the summer vacation approached and the strike dragged on, Dick Brewer decided to close his Haleiwa shop and head for the mainland. He asked Jeff if he'd like to go to California and do some promotions as a Surfboards Hawaii team writer and also work for John Price in his retail store. Jeff jumped at the chance. Hawaii may have been the spiritual home of surfing, but by 1964, the surf city that Jan and Dean sang about was Southern California. The lightness of being that Jeff had sensed in 1959 was now a full-blown surf craze. From the South Bay to the Tijuana sloughs, surfers were God, man. They had the moves, the boards, the cars, and of course, they had the chicks. And the surfers who had the most of everything were the team riders, the heroes whose photos appeared in the surfing magazines, and who could be seen carving at exotic locations in the surf movies, which were now being pumped out at a rate of one a month. Even Hollywood was churning out surf epics like the ludicrous Ride the Wild Surf. In May 1964, Australia's Midget Farley had pipped Joey Cabell to become the first official world champion surfer at Manly Beach in Sydney. But back in California, this may as well have taken place in a different galaxy. Everyone knew that either Phil Edwards or Dewey Weber was the best surfer in the world, with Mickey Dora, Corky Carroll, Rusty Miller, and a host of others just behind. When Jeff arrived back in California, he was astounded at how commercialized surfing had become. When he had left to go to Hawaii, surfers were still very much outlaws, rebels on the fringe of society. Now everyone under 25, male or female, was a surfer or at least looked like one. Surf shops had sprung up on every corner in the beachside suburbs, even in inland Orange County and the San Fernando Valley, and the radio stations played surf music nonstop. The whole scene was out of control, and Jeff loved it. John Price put him up at his own house right above the beach at Leucadia. Says Jeff, "All I had to do was roll out of bed and down the cliff and into the surf. I had to do a little bit of work here and there, but mostly it was just surf, parties, and chicks. I had a crush on Irene, the surf queen. She was blonde and tanned and she surfed a bit. I was just in awe. We didn't have beach bunnies like that in Hawaii." Jeff had his license and access to a car, so he could cruise the coast looking for surf and even slip down to Mexico and surf the uncrowded spots in Baja. And when Brewer shaped him a new board, which was ideal for Californian conditions, he was in hog's heaven. To keep up his profile as a team rider, Jeff entered several contests and surprised himself by winning at Windansea, Solana Beach, and San Miguel in Mexico. One of Jeff's less pleasing jobs that summer was to babysit toddler Laird Hamilton, later to become the totally fearless king of tow-in surfing. Little Laird was an uncompromising individual even then. One night, as Jeff dozed on the other side of the room, Laird hurled a Coke bottle from his crib and cracked the window. Jeff woke up with a start. No, surely a baby couldn't do that. But he had. The Glasser at Surfboards Hawaii had a GTO, which was the fastest means of getting to Baja. Every couple of days, he and Jeff would throw their boards in the back, turn Bob Dylan up on the tape deck, and roar south down the freeway, passing a joint as they drove. Dope had not yet permeated the mainstream surf culture, but around the hip surf shops there was plenty, and despite his reservations, Jeff smoked it fairly frequently. I'd smoke it to be sociable, but it just wasn't my poison really, and I still had this thing about the drug addicts of San Pedro. I'd grown up with my father pointing out these bums to me, the guys who had started out smoking marijuana and had ended up on heroin. That was my conditioning, so I was very wary of the stuff. In his sophomore year at Punahou, 1964-1965, Jeff firmly established himself as Hawaii's hottest young surfer. Surfing Big Sunset remained his real passion, but the summer in California had turned him into a complete performer, and on the North Shore he was pretty much in a class of his own. Pretty much because a gawky kid called Jock Sutherland had also suddenly emerged as a quality surfer in all-sized waves. A goofy footer, young Jock was a superb switch footer who could actually carve a bottom turn on a big wave and switch stance. At the time, many of the better goofy foot surfers switched feet to tuck into the face of the wave, but few were good enough to be called totally ambidextrous. Jock was. His style was perhaps less pleasing on the eye than Jeff's, but Jock seldom caught a wave without doing something totally amazing. He could even move vertically, which, considering the limitations of the equipment of the day, was beyond amazing. He and Jeff soon became close friends. The limitations of equipment were starting to bug Jeff. By 1965, Brewer had sold Surfboards Hawaii and moved into a shop in Wahiwa under the Hobie label. Jeff was still on the Brewer team, along with Jackie Eberly, Kiki Spangler, and Jimmy Lucas, but Brewer had gone off on a tangent with his colored foam concaves. They were the most expensive boards in the world and were considered by many surfers to be the Ferraris of the surf, but they didn't work well for Jeff. They were sure fast, but you had to turn them on the flat or not at all, and I had real problems making them go. So I experimented with all kinds of designs during the summer, but it wasn't until fall that year that Brewer made me a 10 feet, 1-inch gun with a flat bottom, no concave, that I felt comfortable and confident again. That summer, Jeff's friend Chris Green and some of the other stone freak surfers started raving about a new drug experience, something that elevated surfing, even more than pot did, into a quasi-religious experience. The drug was called LSD, or more properly, lysergic acid diethylamide, or even just acid, and its high priest was a former academic named Timothy Leary. In the summer of '65, Leary and cohorts, like the writer Ken Casey, were trumpeting the mind-expanding properties of this new hallucinogenic in San Francisco, then the capital of the beat generation. In Hawaii, capital of the surf generation, people like Chris Green and Harold Bloomfield were quick to pick up on the idea and find a supply. Bloomfield was a left-field kind of guy, the type you'd expect to experiment, but Jeff also began to see that some of the leading surfers were acid heads. People whose ability he respected beyond most others were suddenly full of acid raves. Jeff's good friend Jackie Eberly and John Peck, for example, could speak of little else. But by far the biggest devotee was Paul Gebauer, a naturally talented and stylish surfer who Jeff ranked up near Paul Strow when it came to North Shore performances in the early 1960s, particularly at Sunset Beach. Gebauer was probably the first North Shore acid guru. The drug became his religion, and he moved to Maui and spent much of his time in the Haleakala crater communing with extraterrestrials. Through Harold Bloomfield and other friends like Chris Green and Kiki Spangler, Jeff was introduced to try LSD. They dropped purple Owsley tabs and walked up to the mountains and watched the sun set over the sea. After his marijuana experiences, Jeff's expectations were low, but he liked the surge of adrenaline he felt on LSD and the tricks it played with his mind. It seemed to change the way you visualize things, and I remember liking it very much, except that I felt totally drained when the trip was over. But it was a drug that did something for me, and whereas I could take or leave pot, LSD intrigued me. Jeff, Jock Sutherland, and Jackie Eberly began surfing on LSD. They would score on a Friday, drop the tab on Saturday morning, and go out surfing, regardless of whether it was 4 feet or 20 feet. Says Jeff, I didn't do it too many times, but I found it actually enhanced the energy level out there. It was quite tranquil and very entertaining, what with the colors and all. I mean, I would never take so much I was a giggling mess, but I liked the slight distortion. That was fun. Some of my friends would really take a lot, to the point where they had no idea what they were doing in the surf. They'd be cruising along on the shoulder in another dimension, and they'd paddle back out and tell you how far out the wave was. They just didn't know. I was pretty conservative with it. I kept it in check. A couple of times I remember surfing Big Sunset in Waimea when I was tripping, but that was later. What dimension was John Peck in when he wrote of a Waimea experience? I knifed through velvet darkness on wings of sleep. My subconscious, soft, secretive palms caressed by warm and gentle trades, merged and mingled with plumes of skyward hissing spray. The afterbirth of huge, resplendent north swells overflowing into drives of aggressiveness and yearning, a craving for its voice. By 1968, surfing magazines would be filled with acid rave nonsense. But in 1965, Jeff's buddies were at the leading edge of dope consciousness, poised to go higher and higher before the inevitable plunge to earth. Chapter 9. Driving to school in the carpool one day in the fall of 1965, Fred Van Dyke mentioned to Jeff that he had been approached by Honolulu businessman and nightclub entrepreneur Kimo Wilder McVeigh to put together a professional surfing contest to be held on the North Shore that coming winter. McVeigh's idea was to gather the best surfers in the world to the premier surf location in the world, unleash them when the conditions were right, and let a television crew film it all for a worldwide audience. The contest, to be called the Duke Kahanamoku Invitational, would pay tribute to the modern-day godfather of Hawaiian surfing, Duke Kahanamoku, while perhaps also drawing a little attention to Duke Kahanamoku's, the nightclub McVeigh had set up in the great man's name in the international marketplace in Waikiki. Jeff was intrigued, but he had no idea what Van Dyke was talking about. A professional surfing contest? Like you get paid money to go surfing? That's right, Jeff. Interested? You mean like I'd be invited? If you want, I'll put your name up and I'm sure it'll be accepted. Shoot, really? Yeah, really. Jeff recalls, I couldn't believe I was really going to be invited. It just didn't seem possible. I thought it would be just such an incredible honor, and I really hadn't done much in contest surfing. I'd been in the Makaha contest one year, and I'd won a couple of minor meets in California and Mexico, and that was it. So, Fred tended to go on a bit at times, so I just put the whole thing out of my mind. On November 6, 1965, the secretary of the dean of Punahou School handed Jeff an official-looking envelope. As he walked to class, Jeff tore open the letter. Shit, he wasn't being expelled just because he'd experimented with drugs. It didn't seem fair. Everyone was doing it. But the official-looking letter was not from Punahou. The letterhead featured a shield with a surfer performing an elegant cutback on the right side. It was from the Duke Kahanamoku Invitational Surfing Championships, and it was headed, Jeff Hakman, Esquire. Congratulations on your being selected as one of the world's top 24 surfers to compete in the first annual Duke Kahanamoku Invitational Surfing Championships, December 14th to 17th, 1965. Although this is a first annual, CBS TV is contracted to film the event in color to broadcast nationally. Bruce Brown has been retained by CBS to help with the filming. You will be the guest of Sheridan's beautiful Surfrider Hotel at Waikiki Beach. Your transportation to the islands will be provided, and you'll receive $50 to help defray the cost of meals and other expenses. The letter went on to outline a heavy agenda of social events, starting with a press conference and dinner at Duke Kahanamoku's, including the Don Ho Show, and concluding with an absolute extravaganza awards ceremony at the Waikiki Shell. Jeff stared at the letter in amazement. Surfing had never, ever had anything like this. Acceptance, respectability, Jesus, $50 spending money. Kimo Wilder McVeigh was, in the nicest possible way, a hustler. Jeff, who never met him prior to the contest, later described him as a whiskey and cigarettes kind of guy. In other words, Kimo wasn't very surf, and yet he'd taken on, as his responsibility, the financial welfare of Duke Kahanamoku, who, despite his triumphant sporting career in swimming pool and surf, had not used his money wisely. In 1965, Duke's 75th year, the nightclub that bore his name was the hottest place in town, with tourists flocking to the Don Ho Show every night, and McVeigh made sure Duke got looked after with the proceeds. For the world's first professional surfing contest, no prize money but an appearance fee, Kimo McVeigh secured the sponsorship of not only the luxurious beachfront Sheraton Surfrider Hotel at Waikiki, but of San Francisco's Lucky Lager, the beer drinkers drink. When the 24 invited surfers began checking into the Surfrider on Monday, December 13th, to find a case of Lucky in each room, they immediately began to prove that it was also the beer that surfers drank. The invitees were an interesting mix of respected pioneer big wave riders, California's finest, and a sprinkling of young hotties from Hawaii and the mainland. But there was only one non-American, Peruvian Felipe Pomar, the 1965 World Amateur Champion and a Hawaiian college student. The 1964 World Champion, Australia's Midget Farley, had been overlooked despite impressive performances in Hawaiian waves, including a victory in the 1962 Makaha meet. The other notable omission from Australia was Nat Young, who'd finished second to Pomar in the world titles in a controversial final at Punta Rocas, Peru, and was widely regarded as one of the best young surfers in the world. Nevertheless, Fred Van Dyke and his judging panel believed they had a representative sample of the world's best, with big wave experts like Peter Cole, Greg Knoll, and George Downing, small wave performers like Mickey Dora, Skip Fry, and Dewey Weber, and the new breed inclusions like Corky Carroll, Fred Hemmings, Jackie Eberly, and Jeff Hakman. The judging panel of Wally Froyseth, Mark Martinson, and Buzzy Trent was also meant to reflect this mix, with one judge representing the new, the old, and the big wave crazies. Jeff checked into the Surfrider as instructed and found that he was sharing a room with Mickey Munoz, the head-dipping hot dogger from California who, at 5'4", was the only person in the contest who was shorter than Jeff. Munoz was sprawled on his bed, sipping a Lucky. "You want a beer?" he greeted Jeff. "How cool is this?" It was pretty cool. Jeff opened a beer and checked out his book of restaurant coupons and his free clothes. By the end of the afternoon, a full party was in progress, with Greg Knoll leading the Californians on to more and more outrages. Says Jeff, "I don't remember anything real bad happening. It was just the usual pranks. But there were two groups of surfers. One was the older guys who were into boozing and having a good time, and the other was the young guys who were more into pot and psychedelics." John Peck couldn't stop talking about his acid trips, and it drove Fred Hemmings nuts. He just couldn't believe that surfers would take drugs, and it appalled him. The format of the Duke Invitational was simple enough. 4 heats of 6 to hit the water whenever the waves were good on the North Shore within the 4-day waiting period. The top 2 surfers in each heat to advance to an 8-man final. Van Dyke estimated that the entire contest could be conducted in 1 day, giving all the surfers equal opportunity in the prevailing conditions. When the surfers, sponsors, and organizers met for yet another boozy celebration at Duke's nightclub on the Tuesday night, the word was that the swell was on its way. This was a considerable relief for Jeff, who was ill at ease with the media attention and the hoopla, and just wanted to get on with it. But the party rowdies were undeterred, and some of the surfers who showed up for the bus ride to the North Shore at 6 the next morning looked a little worse for wear. Jeff was not one of them. He felt fit and amped up to surf well. Says Peter Cole, anyone who'd seen Jeff surf Sunset Beach knew he was a very serious contender for this contest. Some of the big-name Californians might not have known, and the press certainly didn't know, but we knew he was the guy to beat. Sunset was 8 to 10 feet and ugly, with shifting peaks and an erratic west swell making it difficult to surf. Peter Cole and some other regulars urged Van Dyke to hold off, but with the CBS crew agape at the biggest and best waves they'd ever seen, and the difficult conditions ensuring plenty of spectacular wipeouts, the first Duke meet was on. Jeff hit the water in the first heat on his 10 feet 1-inch brewer gun, a beautifully constructed board with a narrow tail and 4 redwood stringers. He was up against Kimo Hollinger, Mike Hinson, Joey Cabell, Mickey Dora, and Rusty Miller. Of these, Hollinger probably clocked the most water time at Sunset, but Rusty Miller had been exceptional there the previous winter, and Cabell was always capable of producing an utterly mind-blowing session. But Jeff blitzed them all, emerging a clear winner over Hollinger, with both advancing to the final. As the day progressed, the surf got cleaner with a strong trade wind, if a little smaller. Just after 3, Jeff lined up for the beach start of the final with Kimo Hollinger, Paul Stroh, Felipe Pomar, Mike Doyle, Jackie Eberly, Bobby Cloutier, and Corky Carroll. The break had shifted to Sunset Point, but every so often a bigger set would come through wide and break through to the bowl. Jeff knee paddled quickly to the point, beating the others into the lineup, where he immediately picked up a small wave that peeled enough for him to get a tube ride. It was just the kind of positive start he needed. As he turned to paddle back out, a set came through wide and went unridden. Jeff changed his direction, swung left, and paddled for the channel. Outside in the lineup, he sat alone and waited. The final was an hour long and would be judged on the best 5 waves. He only had one which would have been scored highly on performance, but down on size. If he sat wide and nothing came through, he would be in trouble. But the sets came. The first one was a solid 8 feet. Jeff recalls, "I knew it was a good wave and that I really had to make it count. In those days, you couldn't wind the board around. You could turn off the bottom, but you couldn't really snap them all over the face. The highest performance stuff you could do was pick the line, ride as tight to the curl as possible, and nose ride. So as I took off, I played through what I could do to make the judges sit up and take notice. The big move of the day was the cheater 5. You couldn't hang 10 on a gun, but you could get up there and do a cheater and drive the thing from the nose. So I did that, and the wave just kept getting more and more critical. I dropped lower on the face and slowed down, and then speeded up again and eventually made it right through the inside section, still on the nose. In a modern judging system, I would have scored a 10 for that wave. It was the best I could do. I was surfing above myself, and when I heard people hooting on the beach, I knew the judges would know that." The sequence of Ron Stoner photographs, which subsequently appeared in Surfer magazine, shows Jeff perched on the nose, defying all odds and making section after section as the wave threatens to explode on his head. His confidence at an all-time high, he paddled back out and got another similar wave, although this time his cheater was abbreviated by a side chop that forced him back to the tail. By the time the other surfers realized that the Hakman kid was ripping out wide, it was too late. Not even Stroh, the man who had invented the cheater 5 and was Jeff's hero, could catch him. When the points were tallied, Fred Van Dyke announced the place getters from third up and called them to a little makeshift podium in Val Valentine's backyard overlooking Sunset. Third was Felipe Pomar. Second, Paul Stroh. Jeff went bright red as Van Dyke stated the obvious. As Jeff moved forward to the podium, 74-year-old Duke Kahanamoku clutched him in an emotional bear hug. Says Jeff, "I was overwhelmed. I mean, I hardly knew Duke at that stage, but he seemed genuinely pleased that I had won his contest." The judges had been unanimous, despite early differences of opinion, in awarding it to Jeff. A clear 28 points ahead of Stroh, Freusseth commented, "Jeff surfed as good as anyone I've ever seen at Sunset Beach." Buzzy Trent said, "In my 15 years at Sunset, I've never seen anyone ride the waves better than Jeff. You just can't do better than that." Only Peter Cole disagreed. "Hell," he grinned, "Jeff wasn't even warmed up." On Friday night, a fleet of limousines drove the surfers to the Waikiki Shell, where they received a standing ovation from a sellout crowd as they went on stage to accept their Duke statuettes. The surfers wore matching aloha shirts, and as they arrived, models in grass skirts presented them with floral leis. During the formalities, Mike Hinson, standing next to Jeff, made a whispered joke about wearing grass around your neck instead of smoking it. When Jeff was called forward to receive his trophy, Fred Van Dyke whispered, "Say something, Jeff. Anything." Thanks, everybody. I'm stoked. Is that okay, Fred?" Bruce Brown's new surf movie, Slippery When Wet, was shown, and then a stomp band, The Undertakers, took to the stage and the dancing began. When Jeff and his girlfriend, Linda Bickle, walked into Duke Kahanamoku's nightclub around midnight, a buzz went around the room. Wasn't that the little guy who beat all the top surfers? It hadn't quite dawned on him yet, but Jeff Hakman had arrived in surfing's major league, and his life would never be the same again. Well, that is going to do it for today's episode. Man, can you imagine being 17 years old, being invited to the biggest contest in the world, competing against your heroes, and then winning the entire thing? It's absolutely amazing. I love this book. I particularly love these two sections of the book. Check it out. It's called Mr. Sunset, the Jeff Hakman Story, and it's written by Phil Jarratt. I hope that if you liked the story today, that you're going to take the time to share the podcast with a friend. And if you'd like to help support the podcast, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/The Surfers Library. Your support helps cover the platform fees that help keep this show going each month. Also, if you'd like to sponsor the podcast or have any story ideas or feedback for the podcast, please contact me on Instagram or at thesurferslibrary@gmail.com. Until next time, thanks for tuning in. And as always, keep your toes on the nose, your stoke high, and always, always, always support your local surf shop. I'll see you in the lineup. Today's author is Phil Jarratt. Phil Jarratt is a journalist, author, publisher, and filmmaker with more than 50 years' experience in Australian and international media. Born in Wollongong, New South Wales in 1951, he is a former editor of Tracks, associate editor of Surfer, and editor and publisher of Australian Surfers Journal. He is regarded as one of the foremost global authorities on surfing and has worked inside the executive ranks of two of the world's biggest surf brands, Rip Curl and Quiksilver, where he was a senior marketing executive for 10 years. He has written more than 40 books covering largely sport-related biography, surfing, and surf history, including Salts and Suits, Kelly Slater, For the Love, Surfing Australia, The Complete History of Surfboard Riding in Australia, and That Summer at Boomerang. Phil is also the author of Man of the Cross, the biography of Reverend Ted Knopf, and co-author of Coming Clean, the autobiography of Ian Kiernan. His 2014 bestseller, Bali, Heaven and Hell, is now in its second edition and fourth reprint. His surfing memoir, Life of Brine, published by Hardy Grant in August 2017, is also a bestseller now in its third print run. His History of Noosa, Place of Shadows, was published by Boolarong Press in July 2021. As a filmmaker, Phil has written narration scripts for such surf classics as Busting Down the Door and Going Vertical, and has written and produced the documentaries 8 Days of Pure Stoke, Cup of Tea with God, and Men of Wood and Foam. This last, made for Foxtel's History Channel, was selected for the 2018 Santa Barbara International Film Festival and won the Australian Surfing Hall of Fame Media Award for 2016. His current work in progress, Generation 99, a feature-length documentary about the music and culture of Timor-Leste's children born of war, had its world premiere in Dili, Timor-Leste in August 2019. He is also working on the development of Making Tracks, about the birth of the iconic surfing magazine in the late 1960s, and the forthcoming ABC drama series Barons is somewhat inspired by his book, Salt and Suits. Phil has received the Australian Surfing Hall of Fame Media Award 5 times and was shortlisted for the Blake Dawson Business Literature Prize in 2010 for Salts and Suits. He lives in Noosaville, Queensland, where he writes for the local newspaper and is a consultant to the Noosa Festival of Surfing, which he founded in 1998, and is president of the Noosa World Surfing Reserve.